Hello, and welcome to Autumn's Notes app, where we explore all things written, filmed, and otherwise recorded. My name is Autumn, and today I have a lot of thoughts on the book Never Let Me Go and its film adaptation. Never Let Me Go is the first Kazuo Ishiguro book I ever read, and it's definitely my favorite. It's a 2005 dystopian science fiction novel set in an alternate version of England in the late 90s. I'm not sure if this is popular opinion, but I like this UK cover way more than the US cover. You'll have to let me know what you think about that. Recently, I learned that another Ishiguro novel, Clara and the Sun, is getting a film adaptation starring Jenna Ortega and Amy Adams this October. The trailer seems promising, and I plan to see it when it comes out, but in the meantime, I thought it would be interesting to explore Ishiguro's prior to film adaptations and discuss how they measure up to their book counterparts. Even though The Remains of the Day came first, I haven't read the book or watched the movie yet as of right now, so I thought I'd start by tackling Never Let Me Go. We're going to start with the book, and for that, I've got to tell you the premise. Like I said, it's a dystopian sci fi novel set in alternate 1990s England, and we follow our narrator, Kathy H., in two timelines. In present day, she's 31 years old and has been working as a carer for more than 11 years. She's pretty good at her job, and she's now allowed to choose who she looks after. In the past timeline, Kathy reflects on her childhood at a school called Hailsham, where she and her classmates grew up very differently from other children. There isn't always a clear separation between timelines. The narrative often transitions from present day thoughts to reflections on the past within the same chapter. And even in past focused chapters, present day Kathy will cut in with commentary or insight from time to time. It's also important to note that Kathy, nicknamed Kath, which is how I'll be referring to her, is not an entirely reliable narrator. She's relaying events through her memory, and she occasionally says she might be remembering something incorrectly, or she might have perceived a person's actions or words differently from how they were intended. So keep that in mind as we get into the plot summary. This is also your official spoiler warning because I'm going to tell you everything of significance that happens in this book. So if you want to hear my general spoiler free thoughts, you can skip forward to that section and I will see you there. For everyone who's still here, we begin with part 1. Kath introduces herself and her role as a carer, then launches into the first big chunk of past reflection. And for the sake of clarity, I'm going to give you a lot of the expository information up front. Kath and her classmates go to a school called Hailsham, where they live in relative seclusion from the rest of the world. They attend classes every day, undergo weekly health inspections, and form social cliques like other kids their age. They're taught and watched over by adults called guardians, three in particular of note. First, we have Miss Emily, who is the head guardian. She is kind of an imposing but respected figure. And then we have Miss Geraldine, who is gentle and kind. She's many of the students' favorite guardian. And then finally, the third significant guardian is Miss Lucy, who is brusque but not unkind, and students come to appreciate her straightforwardness as they get older. There are also a few mentions of Madame, an ambiguous authority figure who visits the school a few times a year and remains pretty aloof from the students. In part 1, Kath introduces a variety of her classmates, two of whom become significant in both timelines. First, we have Ruth, a domineering girl and the leader of her and Kath's friend group. Her strong personality gives her a lot of social control, and she's good at getting others to follow her lead. For example, she starts the Secret Guard, a group of students who are on a mission to protect Miss Geraldine from a kidnapping plot. And on the surface, this is all kind of elaborate play pretend, very normal for kids, but Ruth also turns it into this kind of in group where she accepts and expels people based on their standing with her. When Kath gets on her bad side, Ruth expels her from the group and thus cuts her off from their friends. They do make up, but Ruth's emotional volatility is an undercurrent in their friendship over the years. That said, they're very close and they stand up for each other at crucial points in their upbringing. Kath's other important relationship is with Tommy, a boy who starts off as a social outcast. This kind of jokey painting spiraled into everyone making fun of him, which is exacerbated by his violent outbursts in response to the mockery. Kath unexpectedly connects with him in the middle of one of these outbursts, and over time, they begin to share their musings about Hailsham and the world with each other. With that setup, we can get into the actual plot of the book. An early event of significance is Tommy confiding in Kath about a conversation he had with Miss Lucy. She's the more straightforward guardian. Now, one thing about Tommy, he's not super creative, and one thing about Hailsham, creativity and art are important aspects of the children's education. They create art throughout their childhood and they can submit it to the exchange, an event where they can buy each other's art. It's one of the only way for them to acquire personal possessions, and so they treat it with a lot of weight. Tommy claims that Miss Lucy pulled him aside and said it's okay if he can't be creative. He shouldn't worry about it too much. And on one hand, the reassurance has given Tommy his confidence back, and he's re-accepted into the wider social group. But on the other hand, Miss Lucy's sentiment itself is puzzling, and he and Kath can't quite make sense of it. Another odd event is an interaction between Kath and Madame, the ambiguous authority figure. Kath owns a treasured music tape, Songs After Dark by Judy Bridgewater, and there's one song she particularly loves called Never Let Me Go. Wink wink, title mention. She interprets the narrator as a mother who thought she couldn't have children, cherishing her newborn baby and pleading with them to never let her go. One afternoon, she's dancing to the song in her room, holding a pillow and pretending it's a baby, and suddenly she looks up and sees Madame in the doorway, watching her and absolutely sobbing before hurrying off. This leaves Kath with a lot of questions. Did Madame somehow know she was picturing a baby? Did it make her sad because she knows the students can't biologically conceive children as they've already been informed? And it's even more confusing because the children believe Madame is disgusted or disturbed by them. Anytime she comes to take some of their art for her gallery, she avoids looking at them or really making physical contact. So, this emotional display is very strange, and Kath ends up keeping it to herself. A couple months later, Kath's tape actually goes missing. In present day, she speculates that another student probably stole it, and Ruth makes it up to her by A, getting other students to help look for it on the down low so as to not make it a big deal, and B, getting Kath a different tape from a sale. Now, sales are once a month events where the students get to browse and buy items from the outside world. And like the exchange, it's a rare opportunity for them to acquire personal possessions. Even though the tape isn't really a replacement for the one Kath lost, she understands that Ruth doesn't know enough about music to grasp the difference, and this gesture is a great kindness from her. So that's how they make up after their small falling out. And don't forget about the lost tape because it's going to come up again later. Skipping forward a bit, when the children are around 15, there's a day when a group of them shelter from the rain underneath a pavilion supervised by Miss Lucy. The students make conversation to pass the time, and a group of boys starts discussing what it might be like to live as actors. But Miss Lucy interrupts them, shutting down talk of potential futures and emphasizing that they've been brought into the world for one purpose. We've gotten bits and pieces of information up until now, just as the students have throughout their childhood, and you can make inferences based on that, but here for the first time it's stated explicitly. Their purpose is to grow up strong and healthy and donate their vital organs. There's no point speculating about different futures because their path was decided before they were born. Miss Lucy is further upset that no one's being straightforward with the children, and Tommy addresses that when he and Kath talk about it later. And he comes up with a theory. To quote page 81, the Guardians had, throughout all our years at Hailsham, timed very carefully and deliberately everything they told us, so that we were always just too young to understand properly the latest piece of information. But of course, we'd take it in at some level, so that before long, all this stuff was there in our heads without us ever having examined it properly. To put it even more succinctly by quoting part of Miss Lucy's speech, the children have been told and not told. They never knew to question anything because some part of the donation process was always present in their minds, And as information built up, it felt like a natural addition to what they already knew, even though they couldn't perfectly understand what it all meant. I mean, when you're a kid, what does it really mean to donate your vital organs? That changes after Miss Lucy's speech, and donations become kind of a serious subject among the students where they had been a bit of a joke before. By the time the students are 16 and preparing to leave Hailsham, Ruth and Tommy have publicly been a couple for about 6 months, and their relationship signals a pretty significant change in dynamic from the early days of Ruth mocking Tommy with everyone else, and then romantically pursuing him, apparently. As for Tommy and Kath, they remain close and continue to confide in each other. In fact, their closeness is so visible that when Ruth and Tommy split up for a bit, everyone pretty much assumes that he's going to get with Kath next. Kath actually hears this from another girl, and it kind of throws her for a loop, especially because she'd been planning to lose her virginity to another boy just to get it over with. So she's sitting with that info, but Ruth appeals for help getting her and Tommy back together. She argues that she and Tommy were made for each other, and given Kath's special way with him, she'll be able to convince him. When Kath brings this to Tommy, the conversation gets sidetracked into another odd interaction he had with Miss Lucy. Years after she pulled Tommy aside and said it was okay to be uncreative, she apologizes to him and expresses regret over what she said. She says art is important, not just as evidence, but for Tommy as an individual, and she feels responsible for the enduring poor quality of his art. Again, Kath and Tommy can't really make sense of this and what it means, but things change the next day when they learn that Miss Lucy has left Hailsham for good. They aren't given a reason, but everyone knows she was different from the other guardians. Some students think she kind of just lost her marbles, but Kath has a feeling it involves everything she said to Tommy and suspects that it might have something to do with her speech about donations as well. Oh, and Tommy and Ruth get back together that same evening. That's how we end part one. I think the first third of the book is a really strong start. I like Kath as a narrator because she isn't the center of the mystery. She isn't the chosen one, and there's nothing particularly special about her in comparison to her peers, but she is an observer. She is curious about the world and Hailsham's inner workings. She sees what goes on around her, and she continually tries to make sense and understand the significance of things. That gives the story momentum. Nothing feels insignificant because Kath assigns meaning to each memory she shares, whether she spells it out right away or not. If our narrator was instead one of the students who took Hailsham at face value and didn't really question much beyond that, the story wouldn't have worked. Most importantly, part one does a great job setting up the dynamics between Kath, Tommy, and Ruth. That's another reason why each anecdote has value. A lot of them lay the groundwork for the events and emotions that influence them in the years to come. Part 2 starts by switching up the setting and the status quo. After leaving Hailsham, Kath and several of her close friends, Ruth and Tommy included, end up at the Cottages, where they spend their final teenage years living and working. The Cottages are a rundown farm overseen by a grumpy older man named Keffers, and it's a big adjustment for the group. The veteran students take them under their wing, not all of whom are from Hailsham, by the way. Turns out there are plenty of other schools like them, and they pick up on established social rules over time. A big thing is that relationships are more normalized than they were at Hailsham and are respected as a private matter between couples. At the Cottages, Tommy and Ruth continue their relationship, though initially they behave much more overtly coupley in public than the veteran couples. Kath notices that a lot of veteran couples borrow their behaviors from couples on TV, which makes sense because they wouldn't really have anything else to model off of. Eventually, Ruth then starts imitating the veteran couple's behavior and gets upset with Tommy when he doesn't pick up on her cues around other people. One day, Kath gets annoyed with Ruth and points out her mimicry behavior, and Ruth gets annoyed right back and claims it's something she and Tommy are on the same page about. To hit back at Kath, she then brings up something Kath told her in confidence, and hints at it in a way that implies mockery. During one of their late night conversations, Kath had confided in Ruth that she doesn't feel like her relationship with intimacy is normal. Sometimes she gets urges that are so strong that she's had one night stands with a few of the veteran students, even though she hadn't really intended to. Ruth didn't quite get it, but she still listened and comforted Kath. It was a very personal thing to share, which is why Kath felt so betrayed that Ruth used it against her in a fight. From Kath's perspective, they had an implicit agreement that these late night chats were a space to speak openly without judgment, so this creates another rift between them. In present day, though, Kath sees Ruth's perspective a bit more. She realizes that by questioning Ruth's behavior and thus questioning her and Tommy's relationship, that could have felt like a betrayal in itself. Kath then segues into the next big event, which is the Norfolk trip. She's alluded to it a few times already in the book, and it's important to note that Norfolk itself had significance at Hailsham. When the students studied English geography, Miss Emily had pictures of every county except Norfolk, which she once called England's lost corner. And ever since, it kind of became part of the students' mythology that all lost things end up in Norfolk. The impetus for the trip, though, comes from a veteran couple, Chrissy and Rodney. They tell Ruth that when they were up in Norfolk visiting one of their friends, they think they saw a woman who could be a possible for her. This is the next big piece of lore that we get. Basically, each of the donor children are cloned from a pre existing human, and the veterans think the woman could be the model that Ruth was cloned from, aka she's a possible for Ruth. Kath is skeptical both because of Chrissy and Rodney's personalities and also because they describe the possible as an office worker, which resembles the dream job that Ruth has spoken openly about. So Kath is like, maybe they're playing into that. Nevertheless, they make arrangements to check it out, and in the end, the group consists of Chrissy, Rodney, Ruth, Kath, and Tommy. They borrow a car, and once they arrive in Norfolk, they just kind of kill time for a while. Chrissy and Rodney bring up the concept of deferrals, a rumor that if two Hailsham students are truly in love, then they can have the start of their donations pushed back a few years so they can be together. This is one of several points where Kath mentions that other students view Hailsham as in a different category than the schools that they come from. Ruth subtly encourages the rumor, which holds weight because she's kind of established herself as a voice of authority on Hailsham. And Kath backs her up mostly to keep the peace, but Tommy outright says he has no idea what she's talking about. Ruth then tells Chrissy and Rodney they shouldn't listen to Tommy because he isn't like a real Hailsham student, considering he was basically a social outcast. It's a really awkward conversation, but they carry on, and eventually they find the office where the alleged possible works. Chrissy and Rodney see the woman through the window and point her out. She's in her about her 50s, but her appearance and mannerisms do reflect a lot of Ruth. Ruth seems deep in thought about this, and they hang around in a nearby alley for a bit because she wants to take another look in a little bit. But before they get the chance, the woman actually leaves the office and they tail her to a nearby art gallery. They pretend to be engrossed in the paintings while the woman chats with the gallery owner, and the longer they listen, the clearer it becomes that this woman is nothing like Ruth. When they leave, Chrissy and Rodney seem almost relieved. Finding Ruth's model would have affirmed their suspicion about the specialness of Hailsham students and the possibilities open to them. This outcome allows them to bring Hailsham back down to their level a bit. Ruth is understandably very upset, and she rants about how she knew it was ridiculous all along. Their models are not upstanding office workers, they're the trash of society: criminals, drug addicts, prostitutes, etc. Chrissy and Rodney try to redirect the conversation by suggesting they go visit their friend who lives in the area, but Kath is very upset by what Ruth said and says she's not going to go. And Tommy actually says he'll stay with Kath, which upsets Ruth, of course, but they all agree that they're just going to meet back at the car in a couple hours. Fortunately, Kath and Tommy have a much better time by themselves. They decide that they're going to browse secondhand stores to see if they can find another copy of Kath's lost Judy Bridgewater tape. Kath actually does find one, and Tommy admits he's kind of disappointed he didn't find it. He wanted to be the one to find it for her, but he does the next best thing and buys it for her. During one of their conversations, Tommy also gives Kath his theory about deferrals. If it's true, then Hailsham would have to have a way to decide which couples to approve. They must have some way to tell who's actually in love. So, what if they consult the couple's art in Madame's gallery to see if they're a good match? That could be why creativity was so important, and why Miss Emily once said that art reveals your soul. He further theorizes that Miss Lucy apologized because she inadvertently set him up for failure. Because Tommy wasn't worried about being good at art anymore, none of his art ever ended up in the gallery. Neither of them say it out loud, but the issue is obvious. If Tommy's theory is correct, then there's no way for him and Ruth to get a deferral because Hailsham doesn't have any of his art to look at. So, to make up for it, Tommy has been putting great effort into very detailed drawings of imaginary animals while at the cottages. They end up getting back to the car before the others, and Tommy brings up something else. Ruth's rant about their models gave him a bit of an epiphany. One day at the cottages, he stumbled on Kath flipping through adult magazines, and he was confused why she was flipping the pages so quickly, barely even looking at the pictures. Now he realizes that she was looking at their faces, trying to see if any of them were a possible for her. She confides in Tommy about her confusing relationship with intimacy, and she figures the urges must come from somewhere, so she was hoping to find an answer in the magazines. He says he gets those feelings too, and they're probably normal, but Kath doesn't quite believe him. At least, she doesn't believe that he feels as strongly as she does. By the time the others get back, Kath can tell Ruth regrets the way she behaved. Even though she doesn't outright apologize, she spends the whole car ride back to the cottages giving her full attention to Kath and Tommy. It's important to note that neither Kath nor Tommy tell Ruth about the tape. The next bit of time passes without much drama. Veterans leave to start their carer training, including some of the classmates they arrived with. I haven't explicitly said it yet, but carers are the people who look after donors as they're in the process of doing their donations. Also, a fresh group of students arrive at the cottages, though none of them are from Hailsham. The main event in this period is that Tommy shows Kath his imaginary animal drawings, and she's genuinely impressed by his attention to detail. She didn't have super high expectations going into it, which is kind of rough for Tommy, but she tells him that they're really good. One night, Kath and Ruth are joking around in Kath's room, and Ruth sees the Judy Bridgewater tape. She knows how important that tape was to Kath back at Hailsham, so when Kath says she and Tommy found it together, Ruth knows that they both neglected to tell her about this very significant moment they shared. She doesn't make a big deal of it in the moment, but she does steer the conversation towards making fun of Tommy's animal drawings. Kath goes along with it because she's relieved that Ruth didn't get mad, but she does agree, though she doesn't actually believe it, that Tommy's drawings are silly and he shouldn't bother with them. Not long after, Kath encounters Tommy telling Ruth his theory about the gallery and deferrals. Ruth is upset she's only hearing about this now, which is fair because Tommy literally says, "Oh, I told Kath about this ages ago." She verbally tears at Tommy's drawings and says even Kath agrees he shouldn't take them seriously since no one else does. And Kath realizes that Ruth strategically engineered their conversation so she could use it against Tommy later. And since Kath did join in making fun of him, Tommy would be able to detect her dishonesty if she tried to deny it. So as he looks at her, Kath, who has been a largely passive figure even in her own life, does not refute Ruth's statement. This kickstarts the separation of their close-knit friend group. Even though Tommy and Ruth are publicly still a couple, Kath can tell they've grown apart, and she feels unprecedented distance between her and Tommy as well. That said, she feels like her and Ruth are okay-ish, and one day she asks Ruth to go for a walk to kind of clear the air. It goes well at first, and Ruth even admits it wasn't right to make fun of Tommy's drawings. She's actually already apologized to him in private. But then, seemingly out of nowhere, she says, "Hey Kath, me and Tommy might not be a couple forever, but I just thought you should know he doesn't see you as girlfriend material. I mean, he thinks you're great and all, but he's not really into girls who sleep around." And Kath is like, "What?" and they move on to another topic, but she ends up snapping at Ruth over something else. Ruth snaps back, and by the time they go back inside, they can both kind of tell that the friendship is over. Soon after that, Kath decides to start her carer training, and she leaves the cottages without mending bridges with Tommy or Ruth. Part 2 doesn't lose steam at all. It's a very realistic portrayal of how friendships and relationships unravel during the transition into adulthood, especially with external factors at play. Yes, the character's behavior feels childish at times, but they are children, children who were raised in total seclusion for 16 years. This is their first taste of the real world, and they haven't really been given the tools to navigate their emotions. As teenagers, they feel everything very intensely, and they no longer have guardians around to set them on a good path. I also appreciate the gradual expansion of the on page settings. It's not like part 1 is set just at Hailsham and part 2 just at the cottages. I'm sure there's a way that could have worked, but I like that we spend so much time in Norfolk, and there are mentions of trips into nearby villages for supplies. It's an outward representation of the character's expanding perception of the world, and the fact that part 2 is about the same length as part 1 keeps things from feeling static. The beginning of part 3 takes us much closer to present day. Once Kath became a carer, she tried to make the most of it. A lot of people don't adjust very well to the job. They're deeply affected by the solitary lifestyle and the proximity to suffering and death. Kath isn't immune to that, but she learned to carry the negative emotions without letting them drag her down, and she tries to appreciate the small joys in life when she can. She also has a pretty good record with donors, which is why she's now allowed to choose her donors from time to time. One day, Kath runs into an old Hailsham classmate named Laura in a parking garage. I haven't mentioned Laura up till this point because she isn't super important aside from this one conversation, but she was part of the larger girls' friend group at Hailsham, and her and Kath were pretty close friends. Kath can tell Laura is a shell of her former self, like many other carers, and while they're catching up, two important things happen. One, we learn that Hailsham has closed. Kath still doesn't know what to make of its absence from the world, and she feels kind of unmoored from everyone else she grew up with. We do find out more about the closure later, so I'll cover it then. Two, Laura asks if she's considered becoming Ruth's carer. It's common knowledge that Kath gets to choose her donors, and Ruth's first donation didn't go very well. The thought has crossed Kath's mind before, but hearing it from another person is the push she needed to act on it. So after more than a decade without speaking, Kath seeks Ruth out at her care center. They spend some time catching up, and it's, awkward at first considering the multiple elephants in the room, but an opportunity for something different arrives when talk spreads about a moored boat a couple hours' drive away. Kath picks up on Ruth's interest in it and casually asks if they ought to contact Tommy since his care center isn't far from where the boat is. Ruth admits that she knew that, and they're able to start airing out the past a little. Kath does reach out to Tommy's carer, and a couple weeks later, they pick him up from his center. Ruth has a moment of kind of freaking out in the car, but once the three of them are back together, they get to talking like old times. Kath and Tommy do have to assist Ruth on the forested walk to the boat. She's become a lot more frail than Kath realized. But they do enjoy the view. A boat moored in a marsh might not sound too special, but you have to remember they went from Hailsham to the cottages straight to being carers, and for Ruth and Tommy, they went straight from that to being donors. There are so many activities, places, and even concepts that they've never gotten to experience. Unfortunately, things take a turn on the drive back. It starts with Tommy and Kath disagreeing with Ruth about a billboard, which makes her feel a bit ganged up on. And then that reminds Kath of another billboard which she pulls over to show them. It's an ad showing an office space very similar to the one where they saw Ruth's fake possible a long time ago. And she and Tommy start telling Ruth, oh, like, you ought to have looked into it more. Who knows? Maybe you could have gotten a deferral somehow. Out of nowhere, Ruth gets very serious and asks Kath for her forgiveness. Kath is confused, but Ruth tells her, for one, she lied about not understanding the urges that Kath confided in her about. She felt them too at the time, and she regrets making Kath feel abnormal about them. She also confesses her greatest regret, which is getting between Kath and Tommy when they were younger. She intervened even though she could clearly see their connection. Now she urges them to try for a deferral, that if anyone can get them, it would be them. Kath is very upset by the topic, but Ruth gives Tommy Madame's address, which she went to great lengths to get, and she tells him to hold on to it for when Kath changes her mind. Despite the intensity and awkwardness of this conversation, Kath and Ruth are able to speak more openly after this. They don't directly address what Ruth said, but Ruth keeps dropping hints about Kath becoming Tommy's carer. Ruth's second donation goes even worse than her first, and in her final, barely lucid days, Kath promises she'll seek out Tommy again. Kath does become Tommy's carer about a year after the boat trip. He has a single room thanks to his recent third donation, which affords them a bit of privacy as they ease into a relationship. Their days are peaceful, but there is an undercurrent of sadness that they've waited so long for so little time. They know they can't put off the deferral attempt forever, and Tommy gets to work preparing some of his art. Kath checks out the address solo first, and she confirms the house is Madame's, and soon after, she and Tommy go together. Madame is quite surprised to see them, but she does invite them in, and she hears them out but doesn't quite take them seriously, questioning how they could really know that they're in love. When Tommy brings up his gallery theory, she expresses pity for them, then seems to be addressing someone behind them in the room. Here, we learn that Miss Emily is still alive and living with Madame. We get a lot of lore during this conversation, so I'll do my best to lay it out for you. Madame's real name is Marie Claude, and while her relationship with Miss Emily is unclear, they actually worked together to found Hailsham. They were some of the only people at the time who believed in raising donor children humanely, and they joined other like-minded people in opening schools for that purpose. See, after a war in the 1950s, science and medicine progressed rapidly. And all of a sudden, cloning technology could be used to cure many illnesses and diseases that previously would have been fatal. People embraced this brighter world and did their best not to think about where the cures were actually coming from. When Miss Emily and others first pushed for schools like Hailsham, there was a lot of public interest and support from influential figures. That's why the Guardians encouraged the children to make art, and why Madame collected the best pieces a few times a year. They were trying to demonstrate that donor children had the capacity to create, that they had souls and were just as human as everyone else. Unfortunately, this mission was undermined when a scientist named Morningdale made concrete progress towards genetically engineering perfect humans. Though his attempt was ultimately thwarted, the public scandal made people want to look away from everything involving the donor process. As political and financial support withdrew, Hailsham and its sister schools were forced to close, leaving behind inferior, inhumane facilities. Most personally to Tommy and Kath, they learn that the deferral rumor was just that, a rumor. Even though the Guardians tried to dispel it, it cropped up with each new group of students. People just wanted to hold on to hope, but no such lifeline ever existed. Miss Lucy was forced to leave Hailsham because she thought the children should be informed more transparently about things, but Miss Emily maintains that they did the right thing. She genuinely regrets disappointing Kath and Tommy about the deferrals, but she says they were fortunate for their peaceful childhood and for the educated lives that they've led. After that, Miss Emily has to leave, and they don't really get a proper goodbye with her. Instead, Marie Claude sees them off outside, and she and Kath revisit that time that she watched Kath dancing to the Judy Bridgewater tape. Marie Claude says she saw a young girl trying to cling to the remnants of an old world, to resist the new world of scientific advancement at the cost of her and her loved ones. It moved her, and she's been unable to forget about it since. On the drive back to the care center, Tommy has Kath pull over, and off in the woods he has an outburst just like when they were younger. Kath comforts him, but in the following weeks, their relationship doesn't hold the same peace and contentment as it did before. Tommy distances himself from Hailsham, identifying more with his fellow donors at the center and their experiences, and perhaps he distances himself also from her. Kath suspects he feels resentful because she isn't a donor herself and thus can't really understand the nuances of his emotions. Soon enough, Tommy gets the notice for his fourth donation, and the dynamic shifts between them again. Kath thought they were approaching it with a united front, but one day, Tommy brings up getting a different carer. They go back and forth, but his final argument is that he doesn't want her to see him deteriorate and his body break down. Ruth would have understood because she was a donor too, and Kath just can't see it. She storms off in the heat of the moment, but they have a calmer conversation later, and she agrees to arrange for a different carer. Here, Tommy says something really beautiful that's stuck with me since I first read it, and I'd like to read it to you now from page 277. I keep thinking about this river somewhere, with the water moving really fast, and these two people in the water trying to hold on to each other, holding on as hard as they can, but in the end it's just too much. The current's too strong. They've got to let go, drift apart. That's how I think it is with us. It's a shame, Kath, because we've loved each other all our lives, but in the end we can't stay together forever. Their last couple weeks are routine down to the very last day. Things are somewhat surface level since they don't want to start any conversations they can't finish. But Kath does ask Tommy if he's glad Ruth died without learning everything they did, that the deferrals were fake, that a lot of the world is disgusted by them. Tommy says it was probably for the best because she'd be devastated that Kath and Tommy can't repair the separation she caused. Privately, Kath is saddened by the idea that Ruth died with less knowledge than her and Tommy. It's essentially an eternal divide between them. Kath and Tommy part ways outside the center. He tells Kath something he's never told anyone. Back at Hailsham, when the boys would play football, he'd run back to his team triumphantly each time he scored, and he'd pretend he was splashing through ankle-deep water with each step. Kath responds with affection, and they kiss for the last time. She gets in her car, and as she drives off, she watches Tommy wave in the rearview mirror, and he turns and starts walking away just before he disappears from sight. In present day, Kath reflects on how grateful she is for her memories. Though she's physically lost Hailsham and Ruth and Tommy, they'll never truly be gone from her. At the very end of the book, Kath tells about a trip she took to the Norfolk hillside 2 weeks after she heard about Tommy's death. She gazed across a field with trees and a wire fence, bits of trash and debris tangled up in it all, and remembered the myth of Norfolk as England's lost corner. She half closed her eyes and imagined that at any moment a figure would appear across the field, that Tommy would wave as he approached. She allowed herself to sit in the fantasy for a moment, crying as she did, before she got back in her car and kept driving. As promised, I'm going to give some of my spoiler-free thoughts first, so if you've skipped forward to this section because you want to read the book yourself, you're good to watch. After reading Never Let Me Go a second time, it remains one of my favorite books ever. It was so easy to sink back into this universe. Even while annotating and writing plot notes, I devoured it in a single day. I didn't expect to cry the way I did the first time, but I did. Even knowing the end, it was no less devastating, and I want to commend Ishiguro for that. It takes masterful writing to craft a world so vivid and a story so gripping that you experience the same magic and emotional impact upon revisiting it. The relationship dynamics were real and thought out. It's hard to write characters that grow and change as they age while maintaining a thread of consistent characterization. Ishiguro does that very well with Kath, Tommy, and Ruth. Of course, we have to take everything with a grain of salt because all these events are filtered through Kath's recollection, but if we take it at face value, it's an accurate portrayal of how people evolve but retain their core personality as they get older. They mature and take in parts of the people they meet, but they never feel like completely different characters from the children they were at the beginning. Along with that, I appreciate that the book made an effort to include childhood immaturity and coming of age elements, despite the very different setting and serious tone. Things could have been absolutely dismal with no joyful moments whatsoever, but that wouldn't be accurate to the adolescent experience. Kids are resilient even in the darkest circumstances. They joke, they argue, they form complex social groups. Ishiguro captured that well, and it's a better book for it. You wouldn't expect the characters to behave exactly like kids from our world, considering their particular socialization, but it would have been hard to connect with them if they didn't act like kids at all. That's as general as I feel I can be, so now we're going to get into my more specific thoughts on the book. This is your second and final spoiler warning. If you have any interest at all in reading this book, which I highly suggest you do, you should click off the video now and come back once you've read it. Okay, let's get into my thoughts. Something that feels incredibly relevant in today's world is the notion that art serves as a marker of humanity and soul. From a young age, the Hailsham students were encouraged to be creative and make as much art as possible. You could argue it served a developmental purpose, giving them an outlet for self expression. That's probably part of the educated upbringing that Miss Emily said Kath and Tommy ought to be grateful for. On the other hand, the Hailsham admin used the students' art in an attempt to prove their humanity to a skeptical world, as though creativity symbolizes a quintessential quality that only a human could possess. It was their most effective bid for public attention and support, and even then, it didn't hold up in the face of scandal. A majority of people preferred to maintain ignorance about the medical progress they'd become accustomed to, rather than to acknowledge the humanity these children truly did exhibit. Okay, I was getting really warm in here and I had to turn the fan on, but hopefully it's not going to be audible. There's another interesting part of the creativity conversation, which is Tommy's character. Tommy is the only blatantly uncreative student we hear about. While art seems to come naturally to everyone else, his skill level quickly falls behind that of his classmates. It alienated him from everyone and kicked off his temporary outcast status. But if we're equating creativity and artistic output with possession of humanity, what does that say about Tommy? Does his lack of talent at this arbitrarily chosen standard make him any less human, any less deserving of recognition as a person? I actually think the Hailsham admin made a fatal mistake choosing art as the one and only type of evidence to petition the rest of the world with. Surely many different professions and proficiencies existed in everyday life at the time, not all of which included artistic creation. Picking a category so inherently subjective and so poorly understood by the widespread public definitely didn't do Hailsham any favors when it came time for authority figures to decide their fate. Then there's the way the cloning process is presented in general. Based on the info we get throughout the story, donor children are created with genetic material from existing humans. Potentially, this DNA comes from the lower classes of society. We can't be 100% sure, but when you think about who usually gets exploited for the greater good of society, it makes sense. Rather than being cloned as adults, donor children are born as infants and undergo normal development. They make their own memories and form their own personalities and relationships. At that point, we have to ask, how much of a difference does it really make that donor children are cloned from other humans? If they've lived their own lives with the full range of emotional experiences, can we really put them in a different category than biologically conceived children? Couldn't you argue that each donor is a fully fledged individual who simply shares genetic makeup with someone else? We often see that kind of thing in human twins. They can share the exact same genetic makeup and even be raised in the same household, but still turn into completely different adults. I think Ishiguro wants us to confront just how far this society has gone to look away from the reality of the situation. They are, in essence, sacrificing sentient human lives to save other people from disease, people whose only advantage is that their life's purpose wasn't determined at birth. You can't deny that such a mindset already exists in our world. On a general level, a lot of people turn a blind eye to the exploitation that provides them with familiar comforts. People shop at popular chain stores and buy clothes made with unethical labor. They propose with diamond rings that were mined at the cost of people's limbs and lives. A lot of people now use AI to think and make decisions for them in their daily lives, regardless of the communities and ecosystems being wrecked by data centers. If we want to make an even more specific comparison, let's talk about animals. Culinary practices have advanced to the point that you can enjoy just about any dish from anywhere in the world. You might cook chicken at home 2 or 3 times a week, or treat yourself to fancy steak after a big accomplishment, or order specialty crab at a seafood restaurant. We've come to enjoy this food and expect it to remain available, and most of us do our best not to think about where it comes from, about everything that happens before the food gets to our plate. Even if we like animals and we think, cows are cute, it doesn't take a lot of mental work to separate the live animal in a field from the piece of meat in our fridge. Meanwhile, a lot of people still view vegans and animal advocates as moral lecturers who want everyone around them to have as little fun as they do. Yet, as uncomfortable as it is to think about, there is a plethora of research to suggest that animals feel much more than we give them credit for. They're emotionally complex, and their capacity for understanding, for pain, goes much deeper than surface level. They're sentient creatures who do suffer under the terrible conditions they live and die in. So, if we're willing to ignore that just because we've gotten comfortable with the supply of food we like, is it really that far fetched to suggest a society could overlook similar treatment of cloned humans in order to preserve the medical advancements they now take for granted? Would you be okay with the existence of donor children if it meant that no one died from cancer anymore? Would you just do your best not to think about it? Along with this comes what is probably the darkest implication in the book, which is the alternate facilities where donors are raised. Both Kath and Miss Emily refer to the facilities left in the wake of Hailsham's closure. It isn't touched on in much detail, which is certainly intentional. Ishiguro could have gone for shock factor, but the ambiguity lets our imagination run wild, which I would argue is even more effective. From what little we're told, the donors at these facilities are essentially raised as livestock, with no protections or oversight in place. Unlike Miss Emily and her peers, the people operating these facilities do not view donor children as humans. It's chilling to think about, but again, facilities and practices like that do exist. Chickens grow up jammed in buildings by the hundreds and never see the sunlight. Cows are pumped full of GMOs to procure the taste and quantity of meat that people are used to. Seafood creatures are boiled alive to preserve their bodies for consumption, and that's saying nothing of the wildlife hunted and killed for body parts that feed purely aesthetic fields like fashion. Ishiguro is very effective at attaching us to the characters in this book, and through our sympathy for them, we come to question the institutions that influenced the course of their lives and the foundations for such a society that already exist in the world around us. I don't want to end this section on a dark note, though. I also want to emphasize how this book treasures human connection and companionship, even in the face of an inevitable end. Kath, Ruth, and Tommy's friendships are not lifelong. They spend their childhood together, go years without speaking, then reunite when they all have very little time left. It's tragic because they were kept apart by poor communication and selfish choices, and as adults, they don't have the time or the emotional tools to navigate the fallout of those wasted years. But regardless, they played pivotal roles in each other's lives. What they meant to each other as children fundamentally shaped their development, and they still supported each other in moments of extreme change and turbulence. Kath provided Ruth comfort and company in her final days, and the forgiveness she spent her entire adulthood thinking she didn't deserve. Ruth, in turn, admitted her faults and removed any barriers keeping Kath and Tommy from pursuing a relationship. She grounded Kath to their shared Hailsham community, which was non existent after the school closed. Kath and Tommy didn't take their time for granted. They gave each other steady romantic companionship, and when Tommy asked to part ways before he deteriorated, Kath agreed, even though it meant losing him before he was truly gone. All that reconnection and care, the forgiveness and understanding they afforded each other, the maturity they displayed, nothing renders that meaningless, not even death. To further support that point, I want to play a clip of a Kazuo Ishiguro interview that he did in celebration of the novel's 20th anniversary. I found it pretty late into my script writing process, but he speaks very poignantly here, and I want to share it with you.
Fascinating thing for me is the way people respond to being dealt a really bad hand. And sometimes it seems to me that if that's all you know, if that's the world you've grown up in, you cannot see the boundaries for which you have to run. You cannot see what you have to rebel against. And instead, you just try, sometimes heroically, to find love, friendship, something meaningful and decent within the horrific fate that you've been given. So that's the only answer I can usually offer when people say, why don't the characters in Never Let Me Go run away?
Lastly, Kath says something interesting at the very end of the book. It seems to be missing from my UK edition, but I still want to cover it. On page 287, presumably of the US edition, she says, "What I'm not sure about is if our lives have been so different from the lives of the people we save. We all complete. Maybe none of us really understand what we've lived through, or feel we've had enough time." There's validity in that because we all reflect on our lives and regret some of our choices. We form relationships, break apart, and come back together further down the road. In the end, we just want things to make sense, for everything to have purpose, but the existential questions we confront don't always have answers. In that way, we have a lot in common with Kath and other donors' experiences. That said, after reading this book, I think it's important to look around and take stock of everything we have. Things feel pretty miserable a lot of the time, and the world's getting quite dark. But relatively speaking, we have a lot of agency and opportunity compared to Kath and her peers. We can't take that for granted, lest our society begin sliding further towards theirs in such small increments that we don't notice until it's too late. Those are all my thoughts on the book, I say after probably an hour of the video. Now we move on to the movie. The film adaptation of Never Let Me Go came out in 2010 with a surprisingly star studded cast. Kath is played by Carey Mulligan, now most recognized as Daisy Buchanan in the 2013 adaptation of The Great Gatsby, and Cassie in Promising Young Woman. Tommy is played by Andrew Garfield, who acted in The Social Network the same year and had just been announced as the next Spider Man. And then Ruth is played by Keira Knightley, the most solidly established actor at the time. She'd already starred in Bend It Like Beckham, Love Actually, Pirates of the Caribbean, Pride and Prejudice, and Atonement. Whereas the novel was dystopian sci fi with romantic elements, this film is categorized as a dystopian romantic drama. An interesting choice to say the least, so keep that in mind. I also want to note that the film makes Kath 28 instead of 31 for some reason. I don't really get it, but maybe it's some bizarro logic of not wanting to have a female lead over 30. If that's the case, that's weird. I could generously say they didn't want to stretch the actor character age gap too much, but Mulligan was about 25 at the time. I think she could have played 31 just as convincingly as 28, and Garfield and Knightley were basically the same age, so that'd be a moot point too. Anyway, we're gonna start this analysis with my bare bones thoughts on like basic film stuff. I am not qualified to analyze the technical elements of a film, but I don't want to gloss over them completely, so here goes. In general, I thought the cinematography was alright. There was some awkward editing, like a shot that hung slightly too long or an abrupt cut between scenes. It wasn't so bad that I couldn't focus on the story, but I noticed it from time to time. Visually, the film is quite pretty. The lighting team made each scene look natural and believable within its setting, and the color grading made it all pleasant to watch. I don't have strong thoughts on wardrobe. Initially, I thought they could have made a greater effort to style Kath and Ruth differently, but then I remembered that canonically they had limited opportunities to acquire things like clothes, and thus wouldn't have a ton of room to develop like a personal, unique style. With that said, I loved adult Kath's trench coats. I always appreciate a good trench coat. The musical score was also just alright. It wasn't distracting, but it also didn't particularly enhance the tones of any of the scenes. I will say the one exception to that is Never Let Me Go. They actually, let me see, I wrote down the details. Yes. So they got a real life singer, Jane Monheit. I hope I'm saying her name. I hope I said her name right one of those two ways. They got a real life singer for the vocals, and the song itself is composed by a musician named Luther Dixon. And I thought it was really cool that they did an in-universe like rendition of the song. They did a really good job capturing the sound as described in the novel, and that was like a really immersive atmosphere that helped me relate to Kath's emotions in the scene. If you want to listen to it, you can just look up the Never Let Me Go movie soundtrack wherever you stream music. It's the very last song on the album. Oh, and I also like the album cover they came up with. I'll like put a picture up on screen. I couldn't find info on who designed it, but it's pretty much exactly how I pictured it. Okay, bare bone stuff over with. Let's get to what I'm actually here to talk about. The child actors did a solid job, all things considered. This film required very specific subtleties of emotion and performance, and I was pleasantly surprised at how well they delivered. I felt pretty convinced of a connection between young Kath and Tommy, and young Ruth's actress did a good job carrying herself more confidently than everyone else. Their mannerisms and speech styles don't necessarily match the adult actors' performances, but I acknowledge how hard it is to make those things consistent, and my pre existing knowledge of the characters helped me buy into their older selves a bit more. Of course, the adult actors are incredible. Andrew Garfield and Carey Mulligan went on to play bigger roles for a reason, and like I said, Keira Knightley had already established herself as a powerful actress. I felt that any awkward moments were the result of misguided directing rather than poor performance quality. The actors delivered their lines with conviction even when the writing wasn't the strongest, and their subtle facial expressions helped fill the rest of the gap. They're a fantastic cast, and I'm glad it ended up being the three of them. To dive into the meat and potatoes, if you will, I don't feel like the film spent enough time at Hailsham in the beginning. I'm not sure if my plot summary did it justice, but Kath dwells on Hailsham for pretty much the first third of the book. She tells a variety of anecdotes that establish everyone's personalities and relationship dynamics, which painted a vivid picture of her childhood and helped me understand her connection to Hailsham as an adult. In the film, Ruth's strong personality isn't very well established, and she and Kath don't have any conflicts until their late teen years. It undermines the culmination of their eventual fallout, and it makes Ruth's cruelty during that interaction seem overblown, but more on that later. Tommy's status as a social outcast also feels temporary and barely impactful. Other students make a couple jokes about his elephant drawing, and the boys pull the same football game prank that they do in the book. But Miss Lucy then talks to him immediately afterwards and says it's okay to not be creative. And Tommy regains his confidence right then and there, so we don't see the progression of his emotional problems, and it doesn't seem like such a leap for Ruth to go from making fun of him to pursuing him. With that said, Hailsham itself was just as naturey and idyllic as I imagined. There were several gorgeous establishing shots, and scenes weren't confined to a single building or handful of rooms. It seems the Hailsham footage was shot on location in a few different places rather than in fake room sets, and the scenes look better for it. I appreciate that dedication to realism and accurate portrayals. Another thing I can really compliment in the Hailsham section is the setup of Ruth seeing that Kath likes Tommy. Ruth observes them interacting, and during one of her and Kath's late night chats, she gives a gentle prod about whether or not Kath likes this other boy. And in her phrasing, Ruth implies that she knows Kath doesn't like this boy, even though all the other girls seem to. Next thing you know, Kath sees Ruth kissing Tommy by the fountain. And at this point, you can't be sure if she only did that to get between Tommy and Kath, but it does make you wonder, especially given Ruth's displeasure with Kath and Tommy spending one on one time together. This was all done subtly and indirectly, which, of course, is always better than heavy handed dialogue. Speaking of which, one book to screen change I did not like is Miss Lucy serving as a stand in for the viewer. In the book, Miss Lucy is a longtime guardian at Hailsham, but in the movie, she is a new guardian. So we, like her, are an outsider coming into this world, so she provides a clear lens through which we can identify the moral problems at the school. This is a strange choice to me. One of the most skillful elements of the original film is that nothing has to be overtly stated. The extremity of Hailsham and the donor system speaks for itself. The tragedy of Kath and her classmates' lives is inherent. In the film, Miss Lucy making small comments or pulling concerned expressions just to let the viewer know, hey, this isn't normal, felt unnecessary and, well, heavy handed. I suspect they made this change so Kath could ask Miss Lucy what she said to Tommy on the football field, and then Miss Lucy could tell her the truth because, I don't know, she didn't know any better. But I don't see why Kath had to get that information from Miss Lucy and not from Tommy. In the book, their conversation was an important start to their friendship, and it established them confiding in each other. In the film, it instead feels like character A is plainly told something by character B. Also, Miss Lucy being a new guardian removes her lasting presence at Hailsham. It feels like she was only there for a heartbeat and didn't really impact any of the students. In the book, her gradual disillusionment with Hailsham lent much better to our understanding of how cruel this world is, how it can really wear down an empathetic person. Her outburst also held weight because she was a significant figure who many of the children appreciated and looked up to. Of course, the admin had to fire her. She'd be a dangerous influence if she started going against Hailsham's ideologies. To wrap up my thoughts on Miss Lucy, her final speech to the students doesn't hit as hard as it did in the book, nor does it feel as natural. In the book, there was kind of like a gradual ramp into it. The atmosphere was already dark because of the pouring rain. Kath was engrossed in her own conversation, and then nearby, a group of boys started talking about life as an actor. That's what set Miss Lucy off. The film cuts into the scene somewhat abruptly. It goes straight from Ruth watching Kath listen to her tape into a shot of heavy rain outside and some shots of the full classroom. Miss Lucy's at the front of the room, and no one's speaking, so she isn't responding to anything when she just starts off, "The problem is you've been told and not told." It felt really awkward and clunky. There's another strange element to this scene, which is that it's apparently the first time the children learn that their life purpose is to donate their organs. I know the point is to have a concrete reason for Miss Lucy's firing, but the book's version worked fine, even better, I'd argue. I liked that the children received bits of information as they grew up so that there was never one big reveal, but they never had enough pieces to make sense of things. It added intention to the Guardians' actions. They meticulously planned what to tell the students at what age, so the children would grow up thinking they knew about donations all along. It raises questions about their culpability in the emotional reckoning that Kath and her friends faced in adulthood. It's not that they weren't told, but as Miss Lucy said, they were told and not told. It's a moral gray area for Miss Emily and Marie Claude because A, yeah, you have to lack empathy on some level to so deliberately manipulate children, but B, at the same time, would it have been better for Kath and her friends to know everything up front? I think you can make arguments either way. In the film, "you've been told and not told" doesn't really work because apparently the students haven't been told literally anything. Like the scene is played like it's the first time they're hearing about donations, like they've never questioned their isolation at Hailsham before. It makes the Guardians seem reckless. Like, do they think they could just for as long as possible, as if there wouldn't be astronomical fallout once the children discovered the truth? Miss Lucy gave her speech while they were still pretty young, maybe 11 or 12, but if that was overstepping, when were they going to be told? When they were 15, 16, 17? Like, are we meant to believe that all the students before them were equally uninformed? Honestly, the admin are lucky Miss Lucy's outburst didn't completely ruin the program with the current students. Anyway, moving on. As you might have heard me mention, the scene with Kath and her Judy Bridgewater tape is different. Instead of Madame watching her, it's Ruth. Removing Madame from this scene removes her humanization, which felt kind of vital towards her character opening up at the end of the book. Then again, the film doesn't try to make her a mysterious figure. When she visits Hailsham, Miss Emily blatantly announces that she's there to select artwork for her gallery, which was also a taboo topic in the book. And Miss Emily also calls her by her name, Marie Claude, in front of the students, which I don't understand. I liked the details of her book character that put her in a separate category from the other adults, down to the way other people referred to her. I mean, that's probably how she wanted it. She did believe in Hailsham's cause, but the donor children still upset and disturbed her to some degree. So Ruth replaces Madame in the scene, but nothing really comes of it. And also, Kath doesn't lose her tape at Hailsham, and so she and Tommy don't go on an excursion in Norfolk to find another copy. I do regret that we didn't get that bonding moment between them, but we'll talk more about Norfolk in a minute. Once the film arrived at the cottages, I liked that it was a more expansive area with multiple buildings and a whole community of people. Again, it seems like this movie was largely filmed on location, and I think they found a great spot for the cottages. In terms of character dynamics, I really felt Kath's discomfort with existing in the same space as Ruth and Tommy as a couple and witnessing their intimacy. The scene where she calls out Ruth for copying the veteran couple's behavior was well done. Just like their late night chat at Hailsham, it was one of the only times when the dialogue alluded to the emotional undertones in their friendship without outright addressing them. That said, similar to the insufficient character dynamics at Hailsham, it didn't feel like anyone existed at the cottages besides the main trio, plus Chrissy and Rodney. It's not that Kath focused on the veteran students a lot in the book, but they are mentioned and are present for a lot of interactions. In the film, I never felt that the Hailsham students were integrating into an existing social network, and Kath didn't interact with any veterans aside from Chrissy and Rodney, and that'll tie into something I'll return to later. Okay, now we have to talk about everything involving the Norfolk trip, because there are a number of changes. Aside from the very distracting fact that Rodney is played by Bill Weasley from Harry Potter, I thought he and Chrissy were characterized and played well. I liked the deferrals conversation and the implication that they brought it up because they themselves hoped to get a deferral. It gave the actors a chance to perform subtle emotion, and I found that I preferred it over the book's version, which kind of surprised me. Tommy kind of comes off more thick headed during the whole trip, and in general, the film doesn't really give him the credit he gets in the book. Granted, he isn't the most complicated person, but he can still think critically and read between the lines. In the book, when Ruth encourages Chrissy and Rodney's almost reverence towards Hailsham, Tommy at first contradicts her because he's genuinely confused. But after a bit, he catches on that she's embellishing things because she wants the veterans to think Hailsham, and by extension their group, are cool. And at that point, he disagrees with her overtly and intentionally. In the film, most of this happens during the car ride to Norfolk with insufficient buildup. Ruth says like one thing, and Tommy's immediately like, "Nah, that's not true," and it feels awkward, like he's just an oblivious idiot. He doesn't get a moment to truly notice Ruth's behavior, and that's a disservice to his character, in my opinion. Ruth's possible storyline is abridged, which I don't have a problem with. She still gets her outburst about their original models, and even though Kath and Tommy don't go looking for the tape, they still get a little bonding moment. They sit on a bench by the pier and share a quiet moment while the others sort things out. They both say we should probably head back, but neither of them move, and without saying it, they both know that they want to be in each other's company a little while longer. I like that scene a lot. Once they get back from Norfolk, things are off in general. Ruth and Tommy are still intimate, but he seems very removed, while Ruth is somewhat overcompensating to try and remain desirable. Kath is uncomfortable being able to hear them, so she goes to her room and listens to her tape, and when she looks up, she sees Ruth standing in the doorway, which, in hindsight, maybe that's why they replaced Madame with Ruth in the scene to have kind of a parallel moment. But anyway, Ruth confronts Kath about her feelings for Tommy. Similar to in the book, she tells Kath that Tommy doesn't see her that way, but where it was more of a passive aggressive conversation in the book, in the film, it's a much crueler confrontation. Ruth is silhouetted in the doorway like a phantom villain, and by the end of her speech, she's basically towering over Kath on the bed, like hissing in her ear while Kath is crying. It felt very jarring, especially because this degree of Ruth's anger had not really been set up prior to this. There was clearly some jealousy towards Kath's friendship with Tommy, but it wasn't nearly enough to justify this threatening behavior. My best guess is they wanted the friendship breakup to be a distinct cutoff rather than the fade that takes place in the book. There's a world where that could work, but the film's approach sacrifices the nuance of adolescent friendship for a cut and dry scene that left me feeling much less sympathetic towards Ruth than I felt towards her book counterpart. So I wasn't a fan of the change, unfortunately. Okay, my phone graciously shut itself off while I was filming, so if things are framed slightly differently, I apologize. We'll just roll with it. So, not long after, Kath starts her training, and we see her life as a carer in present day. I like that the film showed the inside of her apartment. It's nice but simplistic. Kath clearly takes care of the place, but the lack of personal touches shows that it's not really a home, more like a place to eat and sleep. There's also a great touch when she's leaving her apartment building. As she's walking, in the background, you can faintly hear a baby crying. Kath is surrounded by regular people, some of whom are raising families, but she'll never get to do so. That life is almost within reach, but because she was born a donor, it'll always be just out of sight. When Kath is at the hospital after losing a donor, she happens to see Ruth's file on the computer screen, and she learns from a worker that Ruth is not doing very well after her second donation. And this is what ultimately drives her to seek out Ruth again. I don't mind that the film changed their reintroduction a bit, Since they didn't really explore the girls' friend group at Hailsham, I wasn't expecting them to keep the run in with Laura. It wouldn't have had the same emotional significance anyway, and this approach still serves the purpose of driving Kath and Ruth back together. With that said, it's kind of an odd choice to have Ruth recovering from her second donation rather than her first. In the book, Ruth's poor health is even more alarming because she's only completed one donation. It's a clear example of how debilitating the donor process can be, but it's also interesting to compare Ruth and Tommy's experiences with donations. When they were younger, Ruth was headstrong and combatant, but now her body's breaking down after just one donation. It shrinks her, and even Kath comments on how their dynamic has shifted. She's the carer now, the knowledgeable and worldly one, while Ruth is uncertain and dependent on her. Meanwhile, everyone perceived Tommy as having weaker emotional constitution, and he otherwise had average creativity and intelligence. Yet in present day, he's doing great as a donor. He's able bodied and lively after two donations, and even after his third, he remains very functional. Making Ruth on her second donation instead of her first softens the severity of the contrast between them. Someone makes a comment about how well Tommy's doing, but you don't get a sense of how remarkably unwell Ruth is for her place in the process. And that's not helped when she voices the conspiracy that many more donors die after their first donation than they're told. I think the film could have alluded to the government/slash donation system without undermining just how poor Ruth's condition is. But anyway, once Kath and Ruth reunite with Tommy, their visit to the boat is lovely. I love the imagery of the boat itself, especially the setting change from marsh to beach. It was difficult, for me at least, to get a sense of scope while reading, but seeing the boat tipped over on an otherwise empty stretch of sand was really striking. In the film, the conversation where Ruth asks for forgiveness takes place there on the beach instead of in the car, which I liked as well. It created a powerful juxtaposition between the beautiful scenery and the serious conversation. That said, I don't like the blocking of that scene. And if you don't know what blocking is, it's essentially where each of the actors is told to stand, or in this case, sit in a scene, kind of where their marks are. In the book, it felt like Kath completely forgot about Tommy's existence while she and Ruth hashed out their past conflict. Yes, a lot of those situations involved Tommy, but it was less to do with him and more to do with their friendship. In the movie, the blocking implies a separation with Ruth on one side and Kath and Tommy on the other. Just look at how they're sitting. Ruth's distance reads as though she's an outsider here. It's a completely different tone, as though Kath and Tommy are united against Ruth and her selfish choices. I don't like that at all, especially because the only other scene Kath and Ruth have together is Ruth in her hospital bed while Kath says she and Tommy are going to try for a deferral. First of all, in the book, their deferral attempt didn't happen until after Ruth's death. It was literally Kath's promise to her on her deathbed. And second of all, the film's sequence of events leaves Kath and Ruth's friendship on a really antagonistic note, as though Kath is getting the last word before Ruth literally dies during her third donation. It does a complete disservice to the nuance of their friendship, as I've mentioned before, and it makes things all about Tommy and the love triangle instead of the complicated friendship between two young women. That leads into something I haven't mentioned yet, which is that the film doesn't focus nearly as much on Kath's complicated relationship with intimacy. Like I said in the book's plot summary, Kath struggles with overwhelming physical urges that confuse and scare her. She hooks up with several veteran students without really intending to, which is what I alluded to when I said she doesn't interact with any of the veterans in the film. It's essentially another side effect of this character arc taking a backseat to the love triangle. Kath in the book confides in Ruth about these feelings, and Ruth listens but doesn't really make her feel understood. A little later, Tommy catches Kath flipping through the adult magazines looking for her original model, which he doesn't figure out till a bit later. Tommy figures it out in the movie too, but they don't talk about it until they're adults. And also in the movie, none of that ever comes up with Ruth. Kath doesn't confide in her, which means Ruth doesn't use it against her in an argument, and adult Ruth doesn't admit about lying about not feeling the same way. In the book, Ruth wanted Kath to feel like something was wrong with her. She wanted to hurt her in that moment. It was one of two very impactful, very selfish choices she made that she felt she needed to atone for before she died. It was an interesting way to explore what teenagers' experience of physical desire and intimacy might look like after growing up with a very specific set of ideologies, and how that might affect relationships and friendships. Due to the movie's approach, we don't get any of that, and I think that's a shame, along with the fact that Ruth and Kath's friendship wasn't greatly explored in general. Despite my issues with Ruth's character arc and the film's timeline of her donations, I do support the decision to show her on the operating table flatlining as the surgeons take out one of her organs. It's a fantastic example of how powerful a scene can be even without dialogue. Keira Knightley does like a disturbingly good job of looking dead. I'm not going to put up an image because I don't think everyone has come here looking for that, but it is horrific. The way the doctors calmly wrap up and just leave her dead body lying there because they've gotten what they wanted, it's haunting. And I love the way the wide shot is framed to show all of the living people walking out of frame, just going back to their regular lives. It's a much more gruesome, upfront depiction of the donor process than we got in the book, but it's effective in its own right. It's a portrait of death we can't look away from, and it perfectly conveys the cost of this advanced, better society. Following that, Kath and Tommy's trip to Madame's house was overall well executed. Madame, who I'll now call Marie Claude again, her house and street were just as I had pictured: elegant, private, and far from anything the donors have ever known. I'm sure everything at Hailsham took a toll on her, but at the end of the day, she has a peaceful home to return to, a garden to tend to, Miss Emily and her caretaker George for companionship. Just like the rest of the Hailsham admin, she didn't really have much to personally lose when things went south. The conversation between all of them had to be abridged, of course. In the book, Marie Claude said some pretty nonsensical things, and then Miss Emily exposition dumped for paragraphs at a time. It works completely fine in the book, but none of that would have worked this late in the film. As it is, I think they kept the spirit of the conversation pretty much intact, especially Miss Emily's firmness and genuine regret, and Marie Claude's overall discomfort with the whole situation. I do have a problem with the scene unrelated to the acting and general writing quality, but I will address that later. I really like the static wide shot of Kath and Tommy leaving. Marie Claude escorts them out, but Tommy quickly pulls ahead and hurries to the car. Kath takes her time to let him have some space, and even though she's upset too, she still takes time to say goodbye to Marie Claude. The camera cuts away to focus on the two women, but I actually wish it hadn't. I wish we'd stayed on the wide shot and heard Kath and Marie Claude's parting conversation while still seeing Tommy at the car. Like, maybe he could have tried to open the car door, but it's locked, and his body language conveys frustration as he waits for Kath, barely containing the emotions that he later unleashes on the drive home. It's the only change I'd make to the sequence in terms of the scenes themselves. I have one more specific change to talk about, and that's the choice to have Kath watching at the window while Tommy goes under for his fourth donation. And that choice is, for lack of a better word, wild to me. This moment is actually one of the first few scenes of the movie, which was shocking enough. Like, I understand the writers wanted a full circle thing. Like, you see the moment without any context, and by the time it comes back around, you understand everything that led up to that point. It's a very common storytelling technique, and I don't have a problem with it in concept. However, I will say the choice to have Tommy not request a different carer conveys a fundamentally different version of his character than his book counterpart. You could interpret Tommy's choice in the book as selfish. Kath wants to stay by his side till the end because she loves him, but he doesn't want to look weak in front of her. But you could also argue his choice is selfless. If Kath watched his body slowly shut down the way Ruth's did, that would become her lasting memory of him, overriding even their relationship that they shared in his final days. And to spare her from that, he makes the difficult choice to give up what little extra time they had. He knows what he's asking of her, but it's an enormous sacrifice for him, too. In his final weeks, he'll be surrounded only by strangers, knowing that the love of his life is out there somewhere and he won't be there to console her in the aftermath of his own death. Their emotional processes on the subject are so complex, and I'm disappointed the movie got rid of that. Like, I understand Kath watching him go under is the more romantic path, but mutually painful separation to avoid greater suffering is more heartbreaking. You can call me a masochist for preferring the heartbreaking ending, but I do. It's an unconventional but deeply moving end to their love story, and I'm disappointed the film traded it for a more straightforward romantic approach. I'll say it again, the source material is not a romance. It's a dystopian sci fi novel that happens to include two characters in love, and this is the kind of terrible choice that couples like them would face in a world like this. The Tommy who let Kath see him in his final moments is fundamentally different from the Tommy who argued for a clean break to spare her from his deterioration. If the film writers wanted to win me over to their version of Tommy, they should have planted more seeds to justify his decision. As it stands, aside from the timing of Ruth's death, their relationship plays out pretty much as it did in the books. There is no mention of Tommy being terrified of dying alone, which might have been the most convincing approach, nor any suggestion that he fears death in general. In fact, he proudly says he doesn't think he would have made a good carer, but he's doing a pretty good job as the donor. I truly think the writers should have leaned more into the not wanting to die angle if they really wanted Kath and Tommy to be together at the end. Those are my final thoughts on the specific book to screen changes. I don't think this is a bad film. I've certainly seen worse, but I don't think it sufficiently captures the heart and soul of the original story. That was always going to be a challenge given how rich and complicated the book is and how much lore is implied rather than stated. I appreciated a lot of the film, and like I've said in this analysis, I agree with some of the changes, but I probably disagree with more of them, which is why I ultimately can't call this a satisfying adaptation. That's my opinion on the movie as an adaptation, but the last thing I want to touch on is the merit of the movie as a movie. My main point here is if you went into the film knowing nothing about the characters or the story, I actually cannot fathom how you would figure out any of what was going on. The writing suffers from a common problem in book to screen adaptations where the writers really want to include significant moments from the book, but none of it 100% ties into the rest of what they're doing in the film. Someone has decided to start mowing the lawn right outside my window, so hopefully you can't hear that. My biggest example of this is Miss Lucy's "You've been told and not told" speech. It's like the writers wanted her to give the speech because it's an impactful turning point in the book, but they didn't want to use up more screen time setting up the chain of events. Okay, that's really loud. You can probably hear that. I'm gonna wait for a second. They probably wanted that mic drop moment for viewers who didn't know about the premise of the story going into it, but I would argue that would have been more effective with build up, not without. Another example is Ruth confronting Kath about her feelings with Tommy. The film doesn't establish popular perception of Kath and Tommy, nor the assumption that they'd get together if he and Ruth broke up. Even if the writers didn't want to dwell on that at Hailsham, people at the cottages needed to make comments on Kath and Tommy's closeness, both around Ruth and privately to Kath. That seed needed to be planted in the characters' minds as well as in the viewers. Because it wasn't, Ruth slinking into Kath's room and getting in her face about Tommy seems abrupt and over the top, especially because, again, it's played much more cruelly than in the book. There's no miscommunication involved. Ruth just seems like a bad friend and, frankly, kind of evil. My final example, which is going to lead into something else, is the scene where Kath, Ruth, and their friends stage a run in with Madame to see how she reacts. I didn't mention it specifically in the plot summary, but one day, when the girls could tell that Madame would be coming to the school soon, they created a plan to essentially block her path and see how she'd react. When it happens, the children can tell she's perturbed and a bit fearful of them, and she makes an effort to avoid physical contact as she goes by. It leaves them with a bad feeling, and it's their first indicator that other people feel negatively about them. In the film, they do this in a way, again because it's a prominent scene they wanted to include, but it doesn't work for a couple reasons. One, they don't include any of the children's discussion about the plan. You, the viewer, don't even know there is a plan. Ruth and Kath see the guardians looking over the students' art, and Ruth says, Madame is coming. Then in the next scene, Madame arrives in her car, walks up the front road, and is confronted with the group of children, who turn their heads to watch as she maneuvers around them and keeps walking. It's bizarre. The framing of the scene doesn't give you a clue into anyone's motivations here. The other reason it doesn't work is that the film makes no effort to confront the donor system's wider implications and the attitudes it instills in the public. Madame's reaction in the book is significant because it's the first time the children, along with the reader, realize the adults are disturbed by them, even if they don't understand why yet. It lays the groundwork for everything else you learn about the donor children and the way they're perceived by the world. Even Madame, who agreed with Hailsham's moral intentions, couldn't help but shiver at the sight of them. So by the time you find out about the public's desire to turn a blind eye to the donor system and about the inhumane facilities left behind in the wake of Hailsham's closure, it all makes complete sense. In the film, you don't get the context behind the girls confronting Madame, so it just seems like a weird prank. And later on, Tommy has a couple passing lines about Hailsham's closure and the other facilities, and he says the rumors about their inhumane conditions are probably an exaggeration. And when it comes to the final conversation with Madame and Miss Emily, they barely touch on public opinion. Miss Emily says Hailsham's attempt to prove that donor children had souls was providing an answer to a question that no one was asking. And if people were asked to return to the days of cancer and disease, they would decline. That's it. They don't address how public opinion fluctuated throughout their campaign, nor do they mention the war or the subsequent acceleration of medical progress. I understand they couldn't include everything from the original conversation, but they cut out so much information that was, in my opinion, crucial to our conception of this world. The film zooms in on Kath and Tommy's journey from childhood friends to adult lovers, without doing much work to contextualize why that journey was doomed by the rest of the world. Again, that's the result of it being a dystopian romance drama, not a dystopian sci fi with romantic elements. If you watch the film without reading the book, I don't think you'd grasp the scope of the donor system or the extent to which donors have been pushed into the shadows of society. I don't think you'd feel prompted to examine the events that led to such a status quo or to reflect on similar ideologies and sentiments that already exist in our world. It is unfortunately a lesser experience of the story that Ishiguro told so perfectly. So perfectly that this was probably the inevitable result of any adaptation. In that sense, I can't fault the team too much. I can't imagine the monumental challenge they faced trying to distill this story and these characters into just 1 hour and 43 minutes of screen time. For that reason, I wasn't surprised to learn that the film flopped commercially. It had a $15 million budget, but it only grossed 9.9 million worldwide. That's a pretty significant loss, especially compared to the first adaptation of an Ishiguro novel in 1993, which was The Remains of the Day. That film also had a $15 million budget, but it grossed 63.9 million worldwide and was nominated for dozens of awards, including at the Academy Awards, the BAFTAs, and the Golden Globes. Put a long-term pin in that because I am going to make a video on that book and its adaptation too, for a variety of reasons that might take a while, but hopefully I can get it out before Clara and the Sun releases in October. To give my parting thoughts though, Never Let Me Go is not a bad movie by any means, and if you love the world and the characters as much as I do, I still think it's worth a watch. If you haven't read the book yet, I think you should read it before you watch the movie. Not only because it's the best possible way to experience the story for the first time, but also because it is, in my opinion, the only way to have a satisfying movie viewing experience. That is gonna do it for today's video. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you agree with my points? Did you like the movie more than I did? Are there any changes you would have made? Let me know. If you enjoyed this video or you feel like you got something out of it, make sure to leave a like. And if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you the next time I open my notes app. Bye!